practice questions for DP Geography, paper 1. We're looking today at option A, freshwater. Short answer questions. Question 1, the freshwater unit. And the possible essay questions, question 2, A and B. If you've not done these questions already, please pause the video and take 45 minutes of test time to do these questions. Assuming that that's all done, let's go about thinking how we can answer these questions. So question 1A, state the direction of the Ruva River from its source to its mouth. So the mouth of the river should be pretty clear. We can see that there's Indian Ocean up here, and right next to that, where the river meets the ocean, that's where the mouth of the river is going to be. So we just need to follow this river line up along its course. Oh, there. And so the top of the river, this line around the colored area delineates the drainage basin area, or the watershed, the boundary that separates this drainage basin from the other surrounding basins. And so the top of the river here is going to be our source. So we're looking at what is the direction from this point over here to this area over here. Well, we can see that the orientation of the map is north is facing upwards. So we can just think about drawing some kind of angle between the north line and Indian Ocean over here. You can see that this 45-degree line, okay, so this vertical line is going to be the north line, this eastern line is going to be this horizontal line is going to be the eastern line, and so this 45-degree line here is going to be directly northeast. And so we can see that if we follow that line directly up, we're not going to get exactly to the point that we're looking at over here, this mouth. The mouth looks a lot closer to kind of halfway between the northeast line, 45 degrees, and the east line, horizontal, 90 degrees. So the most correct answer here would be east-northeast. However, I would be inclined to accept northeast. I have seen, don't know if I should say that. I think I have seen some papers where they were very specific about if they wanted east, northeast, or west, northwest, that kind of thing in the past, though. So definitely, I would strongly recommend east, northeast. I would accept northeast, but I cannot say how stingy the markers are going to be in the future. Question 1B, state the coordinates of the sampling location 14 near Bagamoyo. So that's this point here, right? We're looking at S14. Now this sampling location is around this area here of the eastern longitudes, and around this area here of the southern latitudes. So we're using longitude and latitude to express our coordinates in this case. So let's zoom in so we can get a better look at that. And longitude lines going down vertically, latitude lines going across horizontally. And if we follow those kind of points here, we can see it's kind of close to 30, kind of close to 10. That puts us here in Tanzania, so that makes sense. So I'm going to draw a line going horizontally to remind myself that this is the longitude, and that goes up and up as we go from left to right. We can see there's a 38 here and a 39 here, so we're increasing from left to right. And similarly, latitude is increasing as we go down. We're at 630 here and 645 south here. So increasing as we go from the top to the bottom. So again, we're in the southern hemisphere and the eastern hemisphere. And I would want to remember as well that 1 degree is equal to 60 minutes. Okay, so you can see on the top here, there's 38, 38, 30, and 39. So 30 is the halfway point between 38 and 39. The latitudes, the latitudes on the side are showing a different interval than the longitudes on the top. This is going from 6:30 to 6:45, and there's 7 down below, and 6:15 above that we can't actually see. So the increment here is 30 in the longitude, but only 15 in the latitude. And so I'm going to draw a cross through S14, which is my sampling location 14 for the question. And I'm going to look at what longitudes and latitudes are very close to this location. So this 3830 is pretty close, and this 630 is also pretty close. And I can see that it's somewhere in that range for longitude, between 38, 30, and 39. And somewhere, so it might help to draw a line between these points here, 38, 30, and 39. The halfway point of that we know is going to be about 45. And I can see that it's a little bit past, if I follow this vertical line here, it's a little bit past 45, maybe about a third of the way. So I think 38:50, 38 degrees, 50 minutes east looks like about the right vertical coordinate. Meanwhile, we know that this horizontal coordinate is just a little bit less than 6:30. And we can't actually see the 6:15, but because it's off screen, but we know it's between those 2 points because we can see the interval that's here. And so I think it's going to be just a little bit less than 6:30, about 6:27. The convention is always to write the latitude first, however, so we're going to begin with that 6 degrees 27 minutes. This is very different from when you're actually writing coordinates using an area reference or a grid reference system. When you're doing area and grid reference, you can see that the horizontal is always given first, like the x-axis. Then the y-axis is given. When you're doing longitude and latitude, however, the convention is to put latitude first. So 6 degrees 27 minutes south and 38 degrees 50 minutes east is my best approximation. And there's always a little bit of room to error either way. However, only 2 minutes, because we can see that it is definitely not going over this 6:30. It's definitely below that. And horizontal as well shouldn't be too far either side. If you're looking at 48, for example, it seems to be a bit beyond that. You can also express these coordinates without writing the S's and the E's. You might see that on different maps. Sometimes it'll be written -6 and 38. So negative means that we're in the southern hemisphere, and positive here means that we're in the eastern hemisphere. Suggest 2 reasons for the high levels of pollution around Morogoro. So when we're looking at this type of question, let's just zoom in to get a better look. We want to make some suggestions that are based on what we can actually see on the map, so that it has some kind of grounding and some evidence or some reality. And so what can we actually see about this area around Morogoro? Well, I can see that there's an urban settlement area here. That's the pink. The deep pink around the river here. That's right next to the grossly polluted zone. And I can also see that there's a lot of agricultural area surrounding that. So those are going to be some useful observations. And so using my knowledge of different geography processes, what are some possible sources of pollution that might come from these types of land uses? There could be some urban runoff, some sewage or effluent or dumping of waste, some runoff from agriculture, and not directly so much a pollution itself, but something that might cause additional pollution is deforestation, because it increases the runoff effect and increases runoff rates. So a deforested area is going to convey pollutants into a stream more efficiently than a forested basin. So how can we express these in terms of a written format that will answer this question? So there's 2 reasons that need to be given and a total of 4 marks. So I need 2 suggestions which are worth 2 marks each. So here's a mark scheme for this type of question. The first mark will be just identifying a possible source of pollution or pollutants based on the image given. And the second mark is about how well you develop that reason. How can you give how will you develop that? Do you give a reason or a how for what is actually making this pollution get into the river? What are the specific processes that are causing it to happen? And again, it should be related to the map, so not something that's totally out of nowhere. Here are 2 possible 2-mark answers. First, agricultural runoff from nearby farms. So just identifying runoff from agriculture would get you 1 there. Could lower water quality by draining chemicals such as pesticides, herbicides, or fertilizers into the river. Okay, so we have a process by which, so agricultural runoff is the process actually, and then the pollutants here are pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers. And so we can see what is polluting the river and how it's actually getting there. Discharged effluent from nearby settlement area could contain pathogens and high nitrogen content that could harm the river ecosystem. So there's a form of pollution here, and then a process that is getting it to the river, which is discharge. And the settlement area is also identified. Another one that I think could be worth 2, but is maybe a little bit different from these 2 again, because it doesn't actually give us specific this one says pathogens, this one says fertilizers, herbicides. It doesn't give us a specific pollutant, but I think it still answers the question, is deforestation of the surrounding area could lead to higher rates of runoff during rain events, increasing the amount of surface waste entering the river. So this one is more based on processes that could increase pollutants generally, but it's sufficiently well developed that I think it would be worth 2 marks. Now, we can also consider some other answers that might be a little bit more speculative and use less information provided on the map. For example, people in the nearby urban area, so we do have some evidence for that, might dump their waste into or near the river, perhaps because of poor waste management systems. And so we don't really have information about their waste management system, so I don't think it's as strong as the other 2, but I would still accept it because it gives a source of pollution and a process by which that is entering the river. Or people in Morogoro might not have effective education for waste management, leading them to dump their waste into the river without considering or understanding the consequences. Again, I don't like this one as much as the other 3 that were given previously, but it still kind of gives a clear reason. It's the lack of effective education leading to dumping waste without understanding the consequences. So again, these are a little bit more speculative. They're related to some variables that we kind of are just kind of guessing about, but it makes sense. The logic is there. Something that I would be less inclined to accept, though, would be if you were to say a TNC comes and dumps all of its nuclear waste near the river, although these measurements are probably not measuring nuclear waste. Maybe a TNC comes and dumps all of its agricultural waste near the river. Well, we don't really have evidence for that. That seems kind of like far out there in conjecture that's not really grounded in anything that we can actually see on the map. So that kind of explanation I would be less inclined to accept, just any general source of pollution. It should be not just any general source of pollution, but something specifically related to what we can see. Explain how one structural and one planning measure can mitigate flood impacts. So to answer this question, we need to know what is a structural and what is a planning measure for mitigating floods. A structural measure is something that aims to mitigate flood impacts by influencing the physical flood itself. So we're actually moving water into different places or changing the flow or slowing the flow, that kind of thing. So some measures that can do that are levees, strengthening them or heightening them, building dams or flood relief channels, modifying the channel in some kind of way like channelization or enlarging it, scooping out and making it deeper or cutting through the banks and making it wider. Structural measures also include some nature-based solutions like afforestation and wetland revitalization, because again, these are methods of mitigating the flood that will actually change the direction or dynamics of the flood waters. And that is in contrast to planning measures, which aim to mitigate flood impacts by influencing human behavior and actions. So we're not actually changing anything about the flood itself, just how people respond to it. For example, flood preparation, and that can be at the individual or household level or at the government level. Flood warning systems like prediction and forecasting or alerting people when there is a flood incoming. Could be flood zoning, so that is making laws and building codes that require certain types of buildings to be away from the floods or not allowing the building of different types of construction near places that are likely to flood. And another one is personal flood insurance. So having some money to fall back on in case that a flood occurs, so that you don't immediately lose your entire livelihood if a flood does occur. And so for 4 marks, we need to give one of each, a structural measure and a planning measure. And for 2 marks, what is that planning measure? What is that structural measure? And then for the second mark, how does it actually mitigate the flood impacts? For example, let's look at the structure. Aim to mitigate flood impacts by influencing human behaviors and actions. So flood zoning, that's one, can be implemented to ensure that buildings are not developed in high flood risk areas where they're likely to be damaged. And so we can see that there's a river here, and certain types of land uses are okay, like agriculture and recreation close to the river. But as you get further away from the river where the flood risk is decreasing, we're allowing other types of construction. For example, flood-resistant buildings are allowed close to this area. It's still high flood risk, but it's not as high flood risk as these places. So building laws and regulations can dictate what we're allowed to build and where, and that will reduce the flood impacts when a flood does actually come. Additionally, education campaigns can improve the public's risk perception about floods. So people will have a better idea of the possible impacts of a flood, which will make them more likely to take measures that keep themselves safe or protect their property. Making them more likely to protect their lives by evacuating in high-risk situations. And so we can see here there's a class full of students taking a lecture in risk prevention from some members of the community. So now we're going to get into the essay questions. And you all have the same mark scheme for all of your essay questions, that 10-point mark scheme that is going to shape the way that you respond to these questions. So I'm not going to address that directly as much because you kind of should be familiar with that already. What I'm just going to go into is possible answers or possible ways that you could go about answering these questions and the kinds of things that you might think about or kind of questions that you might ask when you are building up towards answering this question and thinking about how you can use your planning time, what kind of issues you think you should be talking about in this section. So that's what we're going to look at in this next review. And you can compare what you wrote against the kind of suggestions that are given here and see if you're kind of on the right track. Of course, that doesn't mean that everything here needs to be included. It doesn't mean that if you have something that's not included, it's not correct or not viable or not usable. But you might consider, does it follow the same kind of pattern, or does it same kind of match the same level of depth that we're going to go into? So question 2a says, evaluate the effectiveness of local water management solutions in dealing with droughts. So when I'm in my planning time and I'm looking at this question, I'm asking myself questions like, what actually makes an effective solution? And how do you know that it's effective? And that's going to form the basis of my evaluation. How can water be managed at the local scale? So what actual methods can we use? And is the local scale much different from other scales? Is it different from the national scale, or is it different from the international scale? Solutions, is this an issue that can be really solved, or does it require some like ongoing effort? What is a drought? Okay, so we're using some actual terminology that we need to know here. And what does it mean to deal with a drought? Are we trying to prevent a drought from happening, or are we trying to actually just mitigate the impacts of the drought? And so what are those impacts, and are we interested in managing the water itself, or are we interested more in managing human behaviors that will see us through the drought? So a drought is characterized. So what is a drought? A drought is characterized by prolonged periods of low precipitation. And so that is lower than usual precipitation, which can kind of depend on different places, because of course different places receive different patterns of precipitation, but in any case it is always lower than what we're expecting for that place, and it's extending for a prolonged period of time. And then that drought can have severe impacts on agriculture, water supply, and that can be for municipal or domestic use, it could be for industrial use, and it can also have ecosystem impacts as well. When we're using water management solutions, we're usually trying to mitigate these effects. So it's very difficult, it's not impossible, to prevent a drought. We can't control the climate just yet, but we can implement strategies that will still allow the community or a region to meet its needs, to meet its water needs. Evaluating the effectiveness of these solutions involves considering the benefits of different management solutions, the limitations of these solutions, and how well they actually address the challenges posed by the droughts. And so when we're looking at this question, we are going to have to analyze various local strategies and their successes in mitigating drought impacts. And we can compare with some other water management approaches. So to demonstrate our knowledge, we are going to have to refer to a couple of different solutions. One of them might be rainwater harvesting, which is where you collect rainwater for future use. And we might look at the benefits of that solution, which is that it provides a supplementary water source. So we're not having to extract water from the groundwater, or we're not trying to rely as much on water that is coming from dams that are shared by everyone. It also reduces flood risk, because if you are in a period where there is not a drought and where there is excessive rainfall, we're actually reducing the amount of rainfall that is running off into the surrounding area that might actually become floodwaters. And it's also pretty cost effective. It doesn't cost a lot to build some rainwater tanks. It might depend on the rainfall patterns in a certain area though, and it might require maintenance depending on the complexity of the system. A rainwater harvesting system like this is not going to be too expensive, and each individual household can buy one. But you might also have more complex systems which involve storage underground or more complex drainage systems, and that might be a little bit more expensive, and especially if it is, and is most likely to be, something that is publicly funded. We could also consider some municipal water conservation practices, so using water more efficiently in the home. For example, toilets which you can have different flush settings depending on how much water you actually need, and you can have appliances that have water ratings. So a washing machine, for example, does it use its water efficiently, or does it use perhaps too much water, more than it actually needs? And so these are often very simple and easy to implement, and they increase the awareness of everybody across the society. But people do actually need to know how to use them and the importance of using them. And because they're usually just at the household level, they need to be adopted by many people in order to actually have significant effect on the community. They may also be unpopular. For example, some people really don't like some types of water shaving shower heads. But another limitation of this system is that, again, we're looking at municipal water conservation, which is really only, and this is, this graph varies depending on different places, of course, but as a whole, around the world, about 10% of our water is used for municipal purposes. So if we're only looking at these types of household changes, we're really not touching 90% of the water use. And so again, that is not going to provide the kind of solution that is going to see a community through a harsh drought season if we're only ever touching on this 10%. So how could we touch that other 90%? Well, agricultural practices could be modified to use water more efficiently as well. And so in our studies of agriculture, we might have studied crop rotations or drip agriculture, no-till farming. These are all different forms of agriculture which in one way or another reduce the amount of additional water that needs to be added. So we don't need to use as much irrigation. We're using the water that comes down as precipitation, or we're using what irrigation we do use more efficiently so that less is just evaporating back into the atmosphere straight away, or less is just running off into a nearby river without actually being used to its full potential. And so increased efficiency enhances soil moisture, but there are costs to implementing these systems, and farmers need to know how to implement these systems. They're often different to the ways that farms have been conventionally run for a long time. To demonstrate our knowledge and understanding, you might use a case study. For example, in my class, we studied the Cape Town water crisis of 2018. And what kinds of things were implemented in Cape Town? Well, there were strict restrictions on what kinds of water people were allowed to use. So 50 liters per day. The city imposed a limit on the amount of water that people were allowed to actually consume. And they imposed fines for people who did not follow these restrictions. Public awareness was important. People were very frequently reminded about the need to reduce their water use as the dam levels got extremely low. Desalination plants were commissioned in order to convert seawater to fresh water. Groundwater was extracted. Water was water infrastructure was invested in to improve the reuse and recycling of water. And water-saving technologies were also promoted, like low-flow shower heads and dual flush toilets. We also looked at some of the more controversial proposals for dealing with the Cape Town water crisis. Public shaming. So the city of Cape Town actually published a website that would tell every person how much water their neighbors were using, and used colors to kind of shame who was the most wasteful when it came to their water, who was using the most water in the neighborhood. And so people could actually kind of pressure each other or feel pressured to reduce their water usage. We also looked at some kind of crazy solutions about dragging an iceberg up from Antarctica, kind of relatively close to South Africa, in order to provide some water for domestic use. And so in the evaluation, you can consider what are the costs and benefits of these different types of solutions. Some basis on which you could make that evaluation. You might want to consider, is it sustainable and is it scalable? So is this going to provide for people's future needs while meeting their present needs? And can it be used at scale? So can it be used for a lot of people over a wide area? You might consider the socioeconomic and environmental impacts. So is this type of solution being implemented going to be beneficial for the surrounding environment, or is it going to kind of come at a cost to the surrounding environment? Or is it going to be equitable across society, or is it going to impact some people more than others in a way that is inequitable? Stakeholder involvement. Who is actually involved in the making of these decisions? Are people allowed to consult with decision makers? Is the local decision making kind of democratic, or is it based on evidence? And comparison with broader case studies, you might be able to compare local solutions with some other regional, national solutions. Although keep in mind that essay question is local water management solutions, so that should really be the focus. It should only kind of be after you've looked at those that you would go into this kind of comparison. So we're not focusing on the regional or the national solutions so much. Now let's look at question 2b. To what extent can internationally shared water resources be sustainably managed? So what kind of water resources are we looking at? Are we looking at rivers and drainage basins? Are we looking at groundwater, for example? Which nations are we looking at? How does the fact that it is shared impact its management, or impact the types of sustainability challenges that we see in that resource? How and for what purposes is the water actually used? And does that actually affect the way that it should be managed? What does it mean to be sustainable, and how can you tell if something's sustainable? So we're probably going to want to define that in our introduction someplace, and we're also probably going to use that as a basis for our evaluation of different management methods. And what kinds of management is possible? What can we actually do at an international level relating to water resources? And who has the power to decide what is done? Who has the most influence over management decisions? These are the kinds of questions that I'm going to want to think about during my 5 minutes of planning time, and to form some thoughts about my essay before I actually go into it and start writing it. So an internationally shared water resource could be a river, lake, aquifer that is shared between different countries and is critical for the livelihoods and the economies of multiple countries. And so we need to consider long-term availability if we're thinking about the sustainability of these places. Long-term availability and quality of the water, while still balancing the fact that this water needs to be used for different economic, environmental, social purposes. So we have competing priorities for these water resources, and these need to be managed so that conflicts don't occur between countries, and so that everybody is able to meet their needs. And so we're going to need to examine the effectiveness of different management strategies, the role of international cooperation agreements, and challenges that might make sustainable management more difficult. And so how can we demonstrate knowledge and understanding the core themes of the geography course? In my class, we've studied the Mekong River. We've also studied the Tigris-Euphrates River Basin in Iraq. But the Mekong River in Southeast Asia, I think, would be a good case study for this. So how are interests and priorities different between countries upstream of the river and downstream of the river? What are some ways that the water is used differently by different places? So we have some agricultural use, some fishing use, some cultural and religious use of the river, and use of the river for power in the form of hydroelectric plants is another competing way of using the river. And so that's going to possibly cause conflict between different places with these different usage priorities. And are economic disparities affecting our ability to implement sustainability practices at different places? Are some countries of greater or lesser income than others in the Mekong River Basin? Maybe a source of challenges might be the fact that there are different legal and institutional frameworks across the river. Countries have sovereignty over the territory that is within their borders, and so they're able to make decisions about what they want to do within those borders, but those decisions can impact other countries around them, even if the policies are being implemented within their own territory. So, for example, something China does within the upper course of the Mekong River, such as building a dam, might go on to affect other countries downstream, like Laos, China, Cambodia, or Vietnam. And so there's some international mechanism by which these countries can come together, and that's the Mekong River Commission. And we see that depicted here in this cartoon of this Chinese dam holding back a lot of water for the rest of the Southeast Asian countries of the Mekong River. And it might be difficult to build consensus on and agreements surrounding different issues in the river. And it might be difficult, even if these international frameworks are set up, to actually enforce what they actually decide. Some variability in the physical geography of the places might also be a challenge for us. So the Mekong River, for example, has this very high altitude section in the upper course, which of course makes it quite ideal for building gravity dams, conventional hydroelectric dams, whereas a country like Vietnam in the lower course is quite a flat area. And so this place is not going to be as useful for the development of a hydroelectric dam. It's not going to be as effective there. And so that's going to lead to different incentives for China as it does for Vietnam. And they're going to want to implement different types of water management or river management systems. They're going to want to use their river differently. But of course, China's use is still going to go and affect Vietnam's use downstream. We might also consider that climate change might be an issue for managing this area sustainably. Is the water quality or availability going to change with climate change? So having looked at the challenges, we also want to balance that against strategies for sustainable management. So maybe A body like the Mekong River Commission, or in some other places like the Nile River Basin, the Indus Waters Treaty. These different international agreements can facilitate cooperation between countries and create some rules for which the river basin can be managed, and it can promote data and information sharing across the river so that people have better access to information when they're making decisions. Limitations could be that the enforcement of these rules can be quite challenging. At the international level, there's not a lot of enforcement. There's no police force that's going to kind of punish somebody who breaks the rules of the agreement. It's kind of just based on mutual agreement. And different levels of commitment. Some countries might be more invested in the outcomes of these agreements than others. Maybe Vietnam has a lot of stake in these discussions about the Mekong River health because it's at the very bottom of the basin, so it's affected by everything that happens upstream. Whereas a country like China is perhaps not as invested in what happens downstream because of its kind of different geographical position. And some political tensions between countries might also be a source of limitation for this. So the government of Vietnam has quite a different form of government than Laos, that has a different government than China. And so these political tensions or political differences between countries might be a source of political tension, and then that might lead to an inhibited ability to actually make decisions along the river. And so the Mekong River Commission, we could see that there's these four main states, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, and then the dialogue partners, Myanmar and China, who are not involved in the decision-making as much, but they are allowed to kind of participate in discussions. Integrated Drainage Basin Management, IDBM plans, is another very relevant form of internationally shared water management, shared water resource management. And so this is a holistic approach that considers the entire watershed. So not just the river itself, but also the surrounding land and the use of the surrounding land, all the different ways that the river and the kind of biophysical interactions happening around the river might go on to influence human and ecological well-being in the area. And so this type of plan promotes efficient use and equitable use of the water resources across the drainage basin, and it improves cooperation between different places and peoples, but it also requires a lot of planning and governance, and it can be very complex when we take into account all of the different factors. So, for example, in this basement development strategy from the Mekong River Commission, we're considering the environmental conditions, we're considering social conditions, economic conditions, cooperation between countries, and also climate change. And you might want to pause the video and look at this diagram to see how many different components this plan actually has to it. We might consider strategies for sustainable management to be some joint infrastructure projects. So hydro dams are a form of joint infrastructure project if they're being financed kind of internationally. So China and Thailand, for example, have been invested in Laos to build its hydropowers in order for it to be able to export energy to different places. So Laos has the ambition to be the battery of Asia by damming its waters and then selling the energy from those hydro dams to its surrounding neighbors in order to develop economically. That can be, on one hand, a source of economic development for Laos and a source of energy for surrounding places. On the other hand, it could also lead to some of the negative impacts of dams on the surrounding ecology and some more local communities, like places that might be displaced from dam developments, like in Luang Prabang, for example. And so that's the example that we see in this case. The Thai Investment Corporation was spending money in Laos to develop this Luang Prabang dam. There might also be some more disputes over the management of these infrastructure projects. and the environmental impacts. So some places, again, like Vietnam, might be more concerned about the environmental impacts than they are about the economic benefits of these management practices across the river. We might use some case studies, or we definitely should use some case studies in order to give examples of internationally managed transboundary water resources. And some good analysis of these case studies might involve looking at the factors that contribute to the success of water management. What places have done well and how have they done well? What led to them doing well? Maybe that was strong governance, stakeholder involvement and consultation, or adaptive management, being able to be flexible and change plans according to different changing circumstances. You might also, on the other side, consider factors that contribute to failure, like weak enforcement, or lack of consensus, or inability to constrain sovereign decision-making. So you can't stop another country from doing something that you really don't want it to do. Or maybe co-opting by economic interest. So maybe there was this dialogue about the ecological impacts of a dam, but the economic interests were just too strong and overcame any kind of opposition based on ecological grounds. Another good angle that you could approach this analysis would be consider the role of different international organizations. For example, across the Mekong River, we see that there's lots of wetland areas which are kind of governed by the Ramsar Convention, lots of UNESCO sites, so World Heritage sites. There's the Mekong River Commission as an international organization. There's ASEAN as an international organization that is focused on economic development in Southeast Asia. There's the UN SDGs, which inform different sustainability practices in the area. And there's also some kind of international NGOs, like the NGO International Rivers. We can see all of these bodies and organizations have different roles in the management of these shared water resources. And so they have different priorities, of course, but they also have different ways of approaching and understanding the issue of sustainability. And so management and building consensus about how this river should be managed will involve some degree of cooperation between these different bodies and some degree of litigation or conversation between these different groups about how things should be sustainably managed. And it might involve funding, technical assistance, and conflict resolution between different parties. So look at resources that have different levels of stakeholder involvement and that have led to different management outcomes across the shared water resource. For example, are some local communities very involved in the management of this place, and is that leading towards more sustainable management? Are some NGOs or private sectors, so like businesses, involved in the management of these shared water resources? And so it might involve some level of contrast between the international level, like the government level, or these bodies that kind of go beyond national borders, like the Mekong River Commission, multi-government organizations, or international NGOs like International Rivers. But it might also involve contrasting those international bodies and internationally focused bodies with some more local or national actors. So maybe local communities do have some ability to influence the decision-making outside of their country, or maybe some national NGOs might be able to influence the decision-making in some other way. Maybe they can lobby their governments, or maybe they can put some political pressure, economic pressure on different places. That might also be an approach to answer this question. So my final thoughts for this practice paper. I think this practice paper was about average in difficulty, and the questions were all very clearly and directly linked to the syllabus, so there shouldn't have been anything that was totally unexpected or totally unfamiliar. This was not a test that was kind of trying to trick you or kind of test the outer limits of your knowledge. A lot of the course content that is in this test is stuff that should have been addressed quite explicitly in your studies. And so what that means is that the difference between a quality response and a response of lower quality will probably come down to how effectively you're able to explain things and how deep you're able to demonstrate knowledge of different case studies, especially for those essay questions. So a good way to go about reviewing that would be to consider what different places can you use in different essay type questions, or to consider what processes are you able to describe in each question case. Are you able to use geographic terminologies in order to give specific processes, or are you kind of relying on everyday language to describe some really more complex processes that ought to be described using geographic processes? Power, so who is able to influence outcomes and what different stakeholders and perspectives are involved in decision-making processes. And possibilities, so what outcomes are most likely and how do you judge what kind of outcomes are most likely? Are places likely to be sustainably managed or places not likely to be sustainably managed? Those are the kinds of ultimate questions that will shape a more effective conclusion to those essay type questions. Okay, so that's this paper 1 finished. Option A, paper 1, DP Geography. Hope this was influential.